I must say, it's a pleasure not only being here, but knowing about the Arkansas Literary Festival. Obviously, a thrilling, ongoing, enthusiastic event. So congratulations to the people responsible for it and for everyone coming and participating in it. It's awesome. So a few remarks. Demas nicely introduced my main thesis, which is the distinction between religion and belief. I want to, there are a lot of very big subjects in this discussion. So I thought what I would do is introduce you to several of the major issues, and if possible, stimulate you to questions and reactions. At the age of 8, I hated asparagus. And one summer when we were visiting my grandmother in central Ohio, where she had a large, really wonderful garden of flowers and vegetables, a lot of vegetables. She let me, for the first time that summer, do some weeding in the garden. Now, this was July, and by July, you know what's happened to asparagus. She had it planted in such a way that it was at the back of the garden. It sort of hung over the back like a green cloud. It was very, very beautiful, really. So as I pulled out a few weeds, I looked back there and I thought, that stuff has gone to seed. I don't know why it has to stay there. And so I went to the head of the row and I started down the row. I didn't get a third of the way down or a fourth before I heard the voice of God. And God used a lot of very large words, like desecration of the earth, or a failure to observe the commandment to honor your mother and father and your grandfather and your grandmother as well. Well, I knew it was the voice of God because it was my great-uncle Fred who was standing over me. Now, Fred was an extraordinary figure. It was said of him, although to my knowledge no one ever tested this, that he had memorized the Bible. It was also said, although this was part of my experience of great-uncle Fred, that he got direct communications from God. He spoke with the voice of God. And as a matter of fact, he looked like it. You know, he was every child's image of the deity, hair sticking out and a huge beard and an awesome presence and so on. But for doing that deed, I got what I think is one of the most extraordinary and in some ways painful punishment ever given an 8-year-old boy. I fled into the barn and stood in a corner trying to get away from him. He stood in the doorway and gave me the entire book of Leviticus. It took hours. So, Uncle Fred, also, as I mentioned, he heard God. God spoke through him. But what I noticed, even as a child, was very, very peculiar. My great-aunt Elizabeth, his sister, also got voices from God. She spoke for God also. But each of them, whatever God said, it was against the other one. So when Uncle Fred had God speaking, it was to point out that Aunt Elizabeth was wrong, and vice versa. So they carried on this huge debate, God speaking on both sides. And so I realized as an 8-year-old that God's in a little bit of trouble here. He deeply contradicts himself. Anyway, I didn't have these reflections at the time, but since then I've come to see that that's a marvelous introduction to part of the drama, the nature of the act of belief. As Dima said, I've been interested recently in late years of the difference between religion and belief. Any historian of religion, and that's essentially what I am, is familiar with the fact that religion and belief rarely overlap each other. You can be a believer without being religious, and religious without being a believer. In fact, I will go so far, it's a bit provocative, but intentionally, of course, to say that, in fact, if you're religious, it's very difficult to be a believer. So I'll try to make sense of those remarks. Talking about belief, I want to make it clear that I'm talking about what we might call true belief. I mean, really intensely held belief, high on the scale of intensity. We all have beliefs that are pretty much ordinary, that have the status really of opinion. I have very, very strong intellectual convictions about global warming. I mean, we're just getting it, I'm sure. And it's terrible. It's going to be horrible for the human race. But I drive a car. My wife has a car. I heat my home with oil. I'm not really a believer. I have an opinion about those things, but no real dedication to them. So let's talk about belief at the other end of that scale. I mean, of course, depending on the intensity, I could do many more energetic things. I could join organizations. I could sit on a tree for a year. I could bomb a refinery, and so on. In other words, if you push up the level of intensity of belief, oddly, when you get to the top, there's not much distinction left between one belief and another. Once you get to violence, the distinctions vanish. And I'm talking about the kind of beliefs that one would die for and even kill for. I don't need to go over the data that we read every day in the newspapers and constantly in the media, that the world right now is suffering greatly from the acts of true believers. So let's, one other kind of introductory remark. You know that in the past several years, there's been a lot of public discussion about belief, about how it's wrong, how religion is is responsible for all kinds of terrible things. And the main attack on belief has been basically an intellectual attack, that beliefs are simply false, they're wrong. Stop thinking these things because they're an error. I'd like to say that even if our beliefs are correct, they can be dangerous. Now let's look at the structure of belief itself. Now, Uncle Fred great Uncle Fred, desperately needed Great Aunt Elizabeth to keep God talking. One of the characteristics of strong belief is that it needs unbelief. It needs opposition. When you talk to strong believers, you're going to hear as much about what they believe as what they don't believe. They are both believers and unbelievers in the same sense. They have a very strong awareness of the opposition around them to the views they're holding. And as a matter of fact, part of the passion, if not most of it, has to do with the fact that they are being opposed. In other words, the more someone, you've all been in these kinds of arguments, the more you go to work on someone's religious beliefs, the stronger they are, naturally. And the reason for that is very interesting, that the believer needs opposition to keep his or her own beliefs on fire, really. And this can go so far as causing believers to stimulate opposition to their beliefs. Demas referred to the Crusades. Just a note on the Crusades. In 1082, I guess, 1082 sounds right, Urban II, quite an amazing, powerful pope, was looking across Christendom, and he saw that the spirit was flagging, that Christians were losing their enthusiasm. There was a lot of secularism, and, you know, from his point of view, also paganism. What to do? And he had a brilliant idea. Let's have a crusade. Let's go to Jerusalem and take Jerusalem back from the Saracens. It was an enormous success, not just for the Christians, but also for the Saracens. They grew hugely in that period and became very, very powerful. So did the Christians. The Crusades have been so important for both Christians and Muslims that it really hasn't ended. It's still going on. So that, you know, we often think of the Crusades as occurring only in the early Middle Ages. Actually, in the 16th century, popes were still organizing, popes and Christian kings were still organizing groups to attack the Muslims. In fact, there were some very decisive battles that occurred in that. Martin Luther himself was deeply concerned about Islam. And where are we now? Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. These are Muslims. And what we find now is, again, really interesting. Christians and Muslims are being supported by this opposition. So to be a believer, you need opposition. Belief flourishes in a context of collision. Secondly, belief needs boundaries. We have to know exactly what we believe and what we don't believe, and we have to be very precise about that. We have to know when we've stepped across that line. And as I said before, believers are very conscious about where that line is. Now, what's curious about a belief system is its integrity, its unity, and we might even say I would even say it's rationality. From the inside, for example, Nazism, fascism. Well, even better, Marxism is an extraordinarily rational system. It makes sense once you're on the inside. I loved teaching Marxism to students because in a couple hours, couple classes, you could have them ready for the march. I mean, you know, for the revolution. It makes such good sense that it becomes irresistible. So from within, a belief system it makes a lot of sense, but it also explains everything. I mean, take Marxism again as an example. We can use any of the great isms, even, you know, marginal ones like, say, pan-Slavism or pan-Arabism or something. They not only are rational, but they explain everything. There's not one element of human experience or human history or current affairs or international relations or ethnic conflicts that are not one of those things that's not covered within a comprehensive belief system. Now, when I say system, I seriously mean system. That is an integrated, finely wrought, well-fashioned series of beliefs. Now, I mean, the simplest possible example. If you ask someone what they feel about abortion, you may find out what they also feel about higher taxes. You might also find out what they feel about guns, about war, about the public support for social organizations and so on. What I'm getting at is that Democrats and Republicans both have belief systems. And, you know, I want to make the point about them too. If I had more time, I would love to do this, of course. How they need each other. Look how the Republicans needed Obama to get excited. I mean, it was really quite a wonderful thing to watch. But fortunately, in American life, those are beliefs and belief systems, but the intensity is not so great. We don't have people bombing voting booths and so on. We're quite really, I guess the word is civilized when we, in those matters. Okay, so beliefs have to have opposition. They have to be in a bounded situation where everyone knows the precise point where you step off into something else. They have to be systematic, they have to be comprehensive, they have to be rational and convincing. And what's more, this is an important point for me, those boundaries indicate not just where beliefs stop, but where your believing stops. That's the point where you stop your thinking, when you've reached the boundaries of belief. I would even, you know, I hope you react to this, or feel free to, but I would go so far as to say that belief can be defined as the point where we stop our thinking and become repetitive and dependent on, very dependent on authority. By the way, one other thing about belief systems, you can see I have a lot to say about this, and a lot more than what I'm giving you. One more very interesting thing about belief systems is that they are timeless. Go back to Marxism. Marx didn't say, of course he was following Hegel on this point, where Hegel had figured out the structure of reality from A to Z, from the beginning to the alpha to omega. So Marx himself, following Hegel, thought that his description of society was timeless. No matter what stage of history you find yourself in, the same forces, the same dynamics are at work. It's timeless. It doesn't change. As a result, as a curious result, they don't last long. They're fragile. Think of Marxism. It is probably the most powerful and dangerous ideology or belief system ever developed. And if you combine it with Nazism and fascism in its many forms, now, by the way, Marxism, I'm sure you understand, I mean Soviet Marxism, Maoist Marxism, and so on. That's another whole, just leave it like that. We'll just call it Marxism. We can ascribe something like 200 million lives given by people who want to prove the truth of their beliefs in the 20th century. That's very powerful. But how long did it last? 1917 to 1992. That's not many years. And Nazism, equally powerful, lasted from 33 to 12 years. That's all. And it was over. It was completely over when it was over. So Soviet Marxism. Now, if you can keep all that in mind, I want to draw a very, by the way, you can see great Uncle Fred is playing all through this, right? I mean, I can go back and show you how he's all of these wonderful things. But Now, let me make a few remarks about religion and how it's different from belief systems. Scholars have been trying to define religion for a long time, and actually beginning in the Enlightenment. And that's a very interesting period, because in the Enlightenment, in the 18th century mostly, people were getting a lot of information. The West was getting a lot of information about religions of the East, especially Hinduism and some Buddhism. And so they started to ask themselves, in what way are these religions related to Christianity? Are they versions of Christianity? Are they false because Christianity is true? And is there something in common that all of them share? So they tried a number of definitions. Things, very simple things, like anyone who believes, every religion has a belief in God somewhere in it, and so on it goes. Or they all have priests, or they all have dedicated lives, or they all have institutions like churches and temples. But I won't bore you with this, but every one of those definitions has a strong exception. The Buddhists don't have priests. They don't even have a god. The Hindus have many gods. And the Christians, by the way, have all kinds of concepts of God. Pretty hard to reconcile. So that doesn't quite do it. Then there came a period where scholars were doing something they called comparative religion, where they thought, instead of trying to find a common thing, let's compare them and see how they share or don't share certain aspects, and so on. This was a title in a lot of college undergraduate courses. That's been, believe it or not, completely abandoned by scholars, and the reason is it was so arbitrary. You could compare anything to anything, and it works. It just, there are no boundaries to it. No limits to what you can do in your comparison. So that's been abandoned. So what do we say about religion? One thing that's come up in one thing I run into in my own work in religion is the astonishing fact that religions have stayed intact for so many years, indeed millennia. Hinduism goes back 4,000 years at least. Judaism, 4,000 years. Christianity, 2,000. Buddhism, 2,400 probably. And so on. Islam, 1,400 years. Now, how can they stay intact all that time? And I do mean intact. I mean, if you're a modern Jew and could speak Aramaic, you could go right back to a Jewish community after the destruction of the Second Temple, let's say in the very early 2nd century, the Christian era, and fall into conversation with rabbis and find yourself completely at home in those topics. A Christian could go back and fall right into conversation with a disciple, with Jesus himself, and so on. In other words, they maintain their unity. To use another example, Hinduism and Buddhism overlapped with each other in northeastern India for 1,000 years. They borrowed each other's art forms, they spoke each other's languages, they were ethnically identical, there are very few distinctions like that, but there was never any doubt who was a Buddhist and who was a Hindu. There was something in Hinduism and something in Buddhism that kept them from reconciling to each other. Even a more vivid example in a way is that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism coexisted, lived right among each other in Europe. In fact, they still do for centuries. And no one ever got up in the morning and asked him or herself, let me see, am I a Muslim or a Jew? They knew. They knew very well what they were. Now, the question rises, what is it that keeps that identity intact? Why is it not lost? Now, the popular view is that, and this is the view I'm trying to get rid of, argue with. The popular view is that they have different beliefs. Now, the reason that doesn't work is, I'll give you an example. Let's say we're trying to figure out what Judaism is. So we list their beliefs, long list of things that Jews are thought to believe. Now, you could look that list over, say, and say to yourself, you know, I believe most of those things, maybe all of them. Does that make you a Jew? Being Jewish is so much more than believing. So we need some other way of understanding it. When, right after, actually even during the Gospels, there was a lot of debate among early Christians. We know this mostly from the book of Acts, about the meaning of Jesus and the ideal nature of the Christian institution and so on. Or to put it in other words, there was a great deal of debate about what Christianity is. And so they realized early this had to be settled. And so they developed a creed. We know it now as the Apostles' Creed. No one knows exactly when it started, but it was already pretty much intact in the 2nd century. The Apostles' Creed is a very strong statement, but it didn't work. So it didn't keep the heresies down. There were extreme heresies. So in the year 325, Constantine, then the Roman emperor, who had been converted to Christianity only 13 years earlier, by his mother too, by the way, it's kind of an interesting story, realized that the heresies within the Christian world were so intense that they were breaking the empire apart. So he called together a very large group of bishops and other important Christian figures to convene in a little town across the Bosporus from what was then Constantinople, a town called Nicaea. The Nicene Creed then became a standard for Christians for many centuries. But that too didn't quite do the job. Now, without laboring it, let me just point out to you something amazing. 5 or 6 years ago, 2 Yale scholars, Yaroslav Pelikan, one of them, very, very renowned historian of religion, especially Christianity, published an enormous 5-volume collection, a book of 5 volumes called, get ready for this, The Major Creeds of Christendom. Christians don't know what they believe. They can't agree on it at all. That's why it's so powerful. On the inside, Christianity is not rational. It doesn't explain everything. There's fighting not with people at the edges, but people from within. If you look at it as a historian of religion, as I do, what you see is an endless fight among Christians over what Christianity is. And in other words, to put it in slightly different terms, Christianity is the attempt to decide what Christianity is. Ask a Christian what it is, what is at the center of his or her faith. you know, most of them have something to say immediately. Let's take the most obvious one would be Jesus. And I would agree, that's at the center of their faith. Now, who's Jesus? And the next thing we know, we are faced with scores of Jesuses, beginning already in the New Testament. The Jesus of Mark is unlike the Jesus of Matthew and Luke, and even more unlike the Jesus of the Gospel of John. In fact, if they met each other, they'd think the others are probably, false. They're anyway, and as we come down over the centuries, there are more and more Jesuses. But that makes Jesus an extraordinarily powerful figure. In fact, what I would like to say is that his name is the best known name ever in all of human history. More people know the name of Jesus than any other human being who's ever lived. And he's also, at the same time, the most unknown person who ever lived. What strikes me as being really interesting about religion is that we'll take the Jesuses right now, not just that they produce a lot of Jesuses and are fighting over it constantly, but that they can't stop asking the question. There's something in there that causes them to keep after it. There's something in the figure of Jesus that makes people crazy. I mean, one of my favorite colleagues at New York University, Harold Bloom, very distinguished professor at NYU and Yale, very distinguished scholar, written a lot of books, and a very, very smart guy, decided apparently a few years ago that he really had to settle the issue, who Jesus was. So he wrote a very brilliant book, very readable book, pointing out that, hey, Jesus was a rabbi. That's what he was. And these Christians got it all wrong. But in a way, all Harold Bloom did was throw another Jesus on the crowd and keep the discussion going. Now, what's interesting, if you look at it from a historical point of view, the most important thing is not what's decided, but what keeps the effort, the energy, the vitality of the tradition from within from dying out. So I think religion is to be understood principally in terms of its ability to find an identity, bear an identity, and hold that identity over millennia against enormous challenges. Just one more example I find so rich. Judaism had no country, forgot Hebrew, spoke a dozen European languages, had no overriding institution, had no dogma, had no creed, had no leader, or even groups of leaders, and still they stayed a powerful, intact religion. I'll just conclude with this remark that one of my favorite observations, Aristotle said at the beginning of the Metaphysics that knowledge begins with wonder. And what I would like to say as a historian of religion, looking at these extraordinary phenomena, knowledge also ends in wonder. And among those wonders, by the way, is asparagus. I love it. Okay, I think that's enough. We'll open the floor to reactions and questions. Anybody?
My name is Patrick Kennedy. I'm Director of Public Programs at the Clinton School. We have time for quite a few questions. The acoustics are real bad in here, so we'll have to pass around a couple of mics. So if you would please raise your hand, I will direct you, and then we'll give you a mic. Start with you, ma'am, right there.
Hello? Okay. You stated that believers need opposition, and why is there the misconception or the fear amongst general religious believers against atheists, agnostics, and religious non-believers?
You know what? I don't think they're afraid. I think they love it. I do, really. I think believers love atheists. Because from a certain point of view, mind you, the atheists are also believers. And you can't be, I mean, just the word atheism indicates a certain belief that there's no God. But if you're going to be an atheist, you have to have a God you're not believing in. So you need a very strong group of people to tell you this is the way God is. Then of course you'll be thrilled because you can say, no, it's not. And I think it works the other way too. Christians love to be opposed. I shouldn't say Christians. I don't want to put it, that's confusing. Just say believers love to be opposed.
Next question. You back there, Mr. Schultz.
Is it a part of your thesis or a corollary of it that a true believer or true believerism is necessarily a bad thing?
Yeah. I'm sorry, but I really think it is.
Okay. Ma'am? Yeah, you're right there.
What escalates a believer into violence?
Yeah, the question is, what escalates a believer to violence? Now, I'm going to try a thesis on you. It's a little abstract and a little sort of intellectual maybe, but let me give it a try. When another way I'd ask your question and get back to a reasonable answer is to ask why it is that so many belief systems develop around religions. Now, if you look back over Christian history, again, you just see one belief system after another. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Thomism, not to mention all the great heresies, that Socinianism, Arminianism, and they're one after another. You could hardly categorize them all or catalog them all. Now, so why Christianity? Why does Christianity develop, encourage all these belief systems? It's almost like a parasite on the religion. Here's my answer. Remember I said that at the core of each religion is something unknown that we can't decide about. It's a mystery. It's a powerful mystery. It's an annoying, disturbing mystery. And if you're exposed to it, you either have to accept it and its intensity, or you're going to have to defend yourself against its power. My belief is that, no, it's not my belief. Here's the way it is. My argument is, we'll put it that way. This is where I stop my thinking, though, I will admit that, is that religions give rise to belief systems because each belief system rises out of an anxiety over its own inner meaninglessness. The Tertullian, a great 2nd century Christian who was converted he was a lawyer, converted to Christianity, made what was really one of the great remarks in Christian history. In Latin, credo quia absurdum est. I believe because it's absurd. And that notion that at the center of things is an absurdity drives people to high levels of anxiety. You need explanation. And I think the closer you get to that absurdity, the more powerful your beliefs become. That's the best I can do with that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're right. They just keep getting more and more violent. And I think it's much more simply, I think it's a way of keeping themselves convinced.
Try a question over there. There's a hand right there. Back there.
Oh.
Could you discuss a little bit your opinion as to why religion seems to be fading out in Europe and growing in the States? And is belief in Europe fading away too?
Europe is a very interesting study because let's go back to 1933. Hitler was no dope. He knew that Germany was a fairly religious, not hugely religious, but fairly religious country. It was both Lutheran and Catholic, 50-50. He knew also that he didn't need the opposition of the church. And at the time, the church was supported by the government. It was actually a government function in a certain way. So instead of cutting the church off, because there were a lot of voices against Hitler among Christians in the early, well, there were always voices against Hitler in Christianity, but especially early. He co-opted them. And he developed the Nazi church, or actually what's called historians refer to it as the Deutsche Christen, the German Christians. And that means the Christians who were, the Germans who were Christians in the Nazi sense, had the swastika in the front of the chapel along with a Christian flag. Well, when the war was over and Nazism died in a day, so did the church. The church was gone. And it'll be a long time before Germans come back to a notion of Christianity that has a non-political but yet relevant validity. I think the same thing is true in the other countries that lived through these terrible years. Europe, actually, if we look over the world, is kind of an exception. Only in Europe would we say that religion, or at least believers, are growing less and less intense. You know, we could also say there's a lot of ideology going on, a lot of belief systems at work in Europe. That's true too. But I think it was a result of the war.
Yes, ma'am.
What about the Declaration of Barmen and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth and those who stood against Nazism and that brand of Christianity and who brought in neo-orthodoxy and a resurgence of Christianity in Europe?
That conference was probably the high point in the Christian reaction to Hitler, Barmen, the gathering at Barmen. One of the more important figures there was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You mentioned him. Bonhoeffer was part of the plot to kill Hitler. In 1931, I think that was the year, he came to New York. He was a member of a very prominent German family, scientists, and intellectuals of various kinds, came to the United States to teach at Union Theological Seminary. And very, very curiously, interestingly, he became involved not in the standard American church, but he got very attached to a church in Harlem that he loved. As a matter of fact, it's the church, oh God, what's it called? The great church in Harlem. What? Abyssinian Baptist. And he just fell in love with the church, the spirit, the people, and in the course developed a very strong sense of social justice and injustice. And then his brothers kept writing him from Germany, so, giving him stuff about what was happening in Germany. It was getting more terrible by the minute. They were also beginning to act against Hitler. So he decided, I think it was 1937 or maybe a little, I don't know, 39, to go back to Germany, 39, and join the resistance to Hitler. And he was caught and executed just days before the end of the war. But the conference at Barmen is an extraordinary moment. And partly because it involves so few people. And we have to realize what courage it took. And what's the word I want? Grieve over the fact that there were so few of them. So it stands as an interesting event in two ways. It shows the courage of people and the lack of courage in Christendom and among Christians as a whole.
Todd, back there.
My name's Todd Moore. I'm one of the students here. Thanks for coming today.
Sure.
My question is about ideologies, and I want you to help me a little bit, because it sounds like you're saying ideology is an ideology, regardless of whether it's Marxism or whether it's religion. It's still an ideology. So no matter whether you believe in one, you believe in another, you're still the same. Help me draw distinctions between the two, because I think there are, or maybe they're not. And I'm really curious about whether, if you had to choose a belief system, what would it be?
Hey, I've already given you my belief system. How are all belief systems equal? No, they're not. Some are not only harmless, but actually quite benevolent. And take the environmental movement. I think that on balance, even though it has a lot of the characteristics I describe, it's a plus rather than a minus in human civilization. So we have to make very sensitive judgments between belief systems at that level. But once they get more intense, once the intensity rises to violence, then I think the distinction is irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference what people believe if they're killing and dying in the name of a belief. But on the way up, there are a lot of distinctions. Good question, yeah.
Yes, Carolyn. 1 second.
I can repeat the question.
I noticed that you used the word believers. I would think that the word zealot would probably be a more precise definition of what they are, because the zealot is completely absorbed in what they believe. And I've noticed that the higher the level of zealotry, the deeper the absorption they are in their source materials, be it AM radio, Fox News, their local
here we go. I knew it would come up.
NPR or whatever. I mean,
yeah.
It seems like it has a particular escalation of intensity of the source material.
Zealotry, by the way, the word, the word zealotry comes from a group that was contemporary to Jesus, who were revolutionaries, basically, and whose thinking was as much political as it was religious. So one of the ways you notice that religion is beginning to lose its identity is when it identifies with something outside itself. And when it begins to identify with a certain political system, with a certain ethnos, with a certain geography, place, with a certain history, then it begins to lose its inner mystery and vitality. One of the things I see happening to contemporary Christianity is a strong drift, a strong overlap of Christianity with political institutions. You know, faith-based stuff and so on. I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but I think that's not only happening now, I think it's happening so significantly that it might be part of the death of Christianity. By the way, you have to remember that religions die. Now, you know, I'm a historian of religion. I mean, I can name lots of them that are now dead, and some of them lived longer than Christianity. And so will Christianity die? Absolutely. It will give itself away at some point. It will lose its sense of mystery at some point. Will Islam? Yes, they all will. But that doesn't eliminate the mystery. It only eliminates the failure to respond to it. So that mystery will remain there no matter what.
2 more questions. Time for 2 more questions. You right there, sir. You see me raising your hand. 1 second. Wait for the mic.
My question has to do with the impact of modern science. There have been much acceleration in our understanding of the world around us, the human genome, et cetera, How is this impacting religion and belief? One day,
when I was in a library, a good library, Williams College Library, I was in the religion section. My eye fell on the collected works of Karl Barth. You referred to Karl Barth. An extraordinary mind of maybe the greatest theologian of the 20th century. No, that's too much, but very, very prominent fellow. I thought it would be interesting to count up the pages that he had written. It comes to something like 10,000 pages. And I did another calculation and discovered that his writing is 600 times longer than the Gospel of Mark. So that what's happened over the centuries, and he's just one guy, remember, almost no one agrees with Barth. Exactly, completely. And so what you get is this, what I think of as a black hole in reverse, this explosion of ideas and thinking and books. And if you couldn't find a library anywhere that would be large enough to hold all the books on Jesus. You know, look sometime for books called What Jesus Really Said, or What He Really Did, or What He Really Meant, or Who He Really Was. Now, what I'm getting at is this, that as we think of the black hole image, there's something at the center of Christianity that keeps driving these intellectual adventures, and more than intellectual. Well, I was in the library, and at this time the New York Public Library, and again, on a kind of whim, stopped at the reference desk and asked the librarian, how many scientific journals are listed in the New York Public Library catalog. He was a little bit surprised by the question. And he looked at it, he looked it up in the catalog, and he said, I don't know if you're ready for this, 4,500 in the New York Public Library itself. Each one of those journals can be read only by people who have advanced degrees in that subject. And almost no one from one journal, those high-level journals, can read another journal. So what we have is the same thing in science, this amazing explosion of knowledge. One of the things I find so amazing, crazy about the anti-evolution movement is that they don't get it. They think it's a belief. Actually, it's just an amazing, brawling, teeming group of guys who don't agree with each other on anything, and they're not going to stop doing it either. So I'd like to. I'm not sure I want to overlap religion and science, but I want to point out their compatibility in that sense, that they both begin. They're both Aristotelian, in the sense that they realize that knowledge it will begin in wonder and also end in it.
One more quick question. You back there, ma'am, or sir? Yes.
You mentioned Constantine earlier and the
Yeah.
fusion of church and state. I was just curious how you see that perhaps in modern America, from Manifest Destiny to the Puritans to even Obama's statements that it's a very special country we have, and how that might be the seeds of something in the future. I don't want to get you into trouble.
No. What you're going to get is more than you asked for, because it's one of my favorite subjects, actually. Let me just see if I can say a little bit about this. You're all aware that when the Puritans came, they had a notion of the city on a hill and a perfect society in God's kingdom, and especially in New England, that it was coming to New England first, and maybe to Northampton first, and then to New England. And the reason Northampton is that Jonathan Edwards was at Northampton, probably one of the few really great original American minds. He is credited with starting what was called the Great Awakening, that became a kind of model for evangelical movements thereafter. And some people think laid the groundwork for the possibility of the revolution. Now, Edwards has been interpreted as saying that America is going to become the kingdom of God on earth. But if you read his sermons, and there are a lot of them, and it's really hard to get into those and read them, what you find out is that New England, God is interested in New England because it's so sinful, not because it's so great. And therefore, the coming revolution is based on a deep sense of our own unworthiness. Not our righteousness, but our failure to minister to the world, the poor, the sick, and so on. And we are a chosen and failed nation all at the same time. So anytime we begin to think of America in those kind of grand theological terms, we have to remember the other side of that theology. We're a sinful nation. We might be a Christian nation, but only to the degree that we recognize our deep, abiding, and unrelieved sinfulness. Ooh, that's a great way to end this.